Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up a cocktail or other mixed drink, give it a sip, talk a bit about its history, some variants, and see how it is. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's list of official cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in Section 1, the Unforgettables, and this week's Unforgettable is the Whisky Sour. Now, I will point out we are almost at the end of the Unforgettables, everyone. Only one more week after this until we move on to the next section, so that's exciting. So, a Whisky Sour. This is a drink with a very long history and a whole lot that's happened throughout. So we'll try to cover it, but I want to be clear that this will not be exhaustive because it just cannot be. This is not a drink we can trace to a guy at a place by any means. What is a sour generally? Because that's a whole class of drink, even though this is specifically listed as a whiskey sour, so that's what two of our variants will be today. The sour goes back quite a ways, and I'm not going to go into it in, again, a ton of detail. It's really the same sort of story as the fizz. So if you go back to our Collins episode and our fizz episode, we talked about how punches were the thing, and then slowly they became lesser punches or short punches, single serving versions of a punch. These are things which would have some sort of spirit, some sort of sweetener, some sort of citrus, and some water in them, right? As they grew smaller, they also grew variants. So one school was the fizz, another school was the sour, as well as something called a fix or a fix-up, likely a reference, as many drinks of the time, to being some sort of a hangover cure or eye-opener. And so a fix-up was probably first, and that consisted of spirit, sugar, water, and then a bit of fruit. Now, it was generally citrus at first, but it was very common to throw other fruits on it. Early recipes say to, top with fruits of the season. And people started adding in a bit of curacao to this, so kind of the same evolution we saw in like fancy cocktails. People also started to throw in pineapple juice, sometimes in place of the sugar. And so that was this thing called a fix or a fix-up. And then at the same time, because our first reference to both of these drinks is from the same menu from a Toronto bar in 1856 that has both a fix and a sour on it. At the same time, the sour tradition came out. Very much the same as a fix. It was spirits, sugar, water, citrus, but in the sour, there were no other fruits added. It was typically just lemon juice in the drink, and a garnish would be either a lemon twist, a lemon wheel, or nothing. From there, the fix died, but the sour continued evolving. Now, it was initially made, as you would expect for that time period, with brandy, cognac, Ginevra, that sort of thing. Over time, people started making it with other spirits, and so whiskey definitely came into vogue sometime in the 1870s. We see it referenced, I believe the first time in print is 1878, but obviously people would have been experimenting before then. We know that sours, by the end of the 1850s, were widespread and common in general, so I'm sure a whiskey sour was tried before then. People then started going crazy with sours. So you see all sorts of sours that have 6 ingredients, 7 ingredients. They've got Benedictine, they've got other syrups, they've got cream, they've got all kinds of stuff. But then that finally fades out. And so by the time we get up to the early 20th century, there's only a few sour variants still kicking around. And by the time sours return after Prohibition, there's really the whiskey sour. There's a few variants out there. There's the question of whether or not to add an egg white. This was originally done sometime in the 1880s in the US, but then fell out of favor a bit and became known as the European way to make it. But after Prohibition, that became very popular here again. There's also a common thing to put a float of red wine on top of a sour. This is often called a New York sour, even though it probably originated in Chicago, and everyone who credits it as a New York sour was not from New York. All the earliest references to it being a New York sour are from Boston or further west, which is weird. But that was a common thing. You still see that a little bit today, but today traditionally you see it pretty much as a whiskey sour or some other base spirit sour you can make. I've mentioned in previous episodes when doing variants, this is basically just turning into a gin sour or something like that. And so today, sours are pretty much going to be spirit, sugar, lemon, and then maybe an egg white, maybe a few dashes of something or a float of something. So with all that out of the way, I gotta tell you that I love a whiskey sour. I love any kind of sour, but whiskey sour is a drink I really fell in love with. I got into it for stupid reasons because there's a great chorus in a Murder by Death song called Masters in Reverse Psychology. See my multiple copies of the album over there. And it's a really pivotal part of the album, and they talk about whiskey sours, and that makes me happy. So that's not the only reason. It's also just a great drink, but every time I make one, I think of the struggles that the protagonist is going through in the middle of the album, Who Will Survive and What Will Be Left of Them. So, with that totally uninteresting information out of the way, we're going to do 3 different variants today. First one is going to be IBA spec. Second one is going to be more like how the drink would have been made 100 plus years ago. And the third one is not a whiskey sour at all, but it's a drink that I think is interesting for a couple reasons. Let's get right to it. All right, for the IBA spec, we're gonna start off with some 2-to-1 simple. We want 20 milliliters of this, that's about 2/3 of an ounce. And I do, as always, encourage you to make your own simple and to make it at 2-to-1. 2-to-1 adds less dilution to the drink and is shelf stable. So please make your own. I just made another batch earlier today, and it's so worth it. So the sugar amount that you use in this is very much to taste. 20 milliliters is what the IBA calls for, but I will not judge you whether you go up or down on that number. Historically, that number's been all over the place. Really early versions use actually quite a bit of sugar, and then there are some medium old versions that use very, very little sugar. It's completely based on what you want in your life. Then lemon, our main flavoring component, we want about 25 milliliters. So that's a little bit less than an ounce, but getting up there. Again though, this is very much a drink that you can make to whatever proportions make sense to you. There's only 3 real ingredients, so feel free to balance however you like. Then for our base spirit, I'm pulling out the JTS Brown. I just think this is an interesting spirit. It is, I've said before, I believe it is the cheapest bonded spirit that exists. It's like $13 or $14 for a bonded spirit with a history that goes back hundreds of years, and it's 100 proof and is pretty good. And so I think a simple drink like this is a great way to show that it does hold up. And so we want 45 milliliters, that's 1.5 ounces thereabouts of the JTS Brown or other bourbon. There are some early variants that prefer rye. I think that's a great choice. You know I love rye. We're just not doing it today, but that's a great thing to use in there. And then finally, the IBA has egg white as optional. I think yes. IBA calls for 20 milliliters, which if you're in a bar and you pre-measure your egg whites, that's fantastic. If not, you need about half an egg white with today's large eggs. So I just put in the whole thing because it's easier and it'll work fine. But if you were making a double serving of this, you could just split 1 egg white between them. Then IBA does not call for it, but because I really like this drink and want it to be the best it can, I am going to go ahead and give this a dry shake for a little while. That's because I'm using the egg white. I really want to incorporate that and start to aerate it before I add in the ice. It's not going to foam as much once the ice is in. Also, just a reminder, if you're using a Boston style shaker, on a dry shake, make sure you hold both sides because there's no suction being created without the ice. Let's give it a proper shake. Then the IBA calls for this to be strained into a cobbler glass, which is kind of an odd choice because there is actually a glass called a sour glass that exists, which is similar to a cobbler glass, but not quite the same. However, I can't protest too much because I don't own any sour glasses or cobbler glasses, so I'm going to go ahead and strain this into an ideally chilled coupe. IBA does mention that going for an on the rocks presentation is acceptable for this drink as well, which absolutely. And that's how we're gonna do the next variant. But in their photo, they show it as an up drink, and that did become the most common style after Prohibition for sure. I got a little bit of foam on there, not quite as much as I would have liked. I maybe should have dry shaken a bit more, but not too bad. As far as garnish, IBA goes a little bit crazy here. As we mentioned, the biggest difference between a fix and a sour is that a sour only has lemon, whereas a fix had all kinds of fruits. As for garnish, IBA wants both orange and cherry here. For orange, they recommend a slice, but say that they, or it might be a wheel, I don't know, wheel or slice, but they say that they'll accept zest instead. We are gonna go with zest for sure. Nice big strip there, express that. And then I'll just toss in a nice maraschino cherry and get a few little drops on top. I like that look. Looks kind of like bitters dots. And that is the IBA spec Whisky Sour. Yeah, you know what? As it's settling here, the head has improved a bit. I do like the look of that actually. So on the nose, I get lots of orange, which is fine, but I don't really need it. It is enough to cover up. Sometimes on egg white heavy drinks, you get that weird soapy flavor or smell right at the very front of the nose, and I don't get that, which is nice. The drink's great. Got a nice textured mouthfeel. It's balanced. I think I would actually like maybe a hair more lemon. I'd like it to just zing a little bit harder. Or maybe a hair less sugar. Because I'm getting the bourbon and the lemon, and they're doing something really cool, but they're just slightly further back than I want to see them. The very front of my tongue, it's just getting the mouthfeel and a hint of sweetness. And then it's like, oh my goodness, I've got some whiskey notes. Is that barrel? And wow, it's bright and a little bit citrusy, and that's fun. I would just like that to hit a hair earlier. So I think we could either slightly cut the sugar, we could slightly increase the lemon, or we could replace part of the sugar. Maybe, I've not tried this, but going in that fixed direction, replace part of the sugar with dry curacao so that our sweetness element was also citrus integrated. It's a great drink though. I could drink so many of these. And yeah, the orange is doing absolutely nothing for us. And my question is always, how well does the cherry actually integrate? Well, so I don't think you need the cherry, but the cherry goes really nicely with lemon and whiskey. All right, so for version 2, we're gonna make something, like I said, a bit more like how you might have seen this in the 1870s, 1880s. I'm gonna change it up slightly. The method is usually to build it in a tumbler, which we're gonna do. The method usually calls for starting with ice, then adding both sugar and water and lemon to dissolve the sugar, and then finishing the drink. I don't love that approach because we need to use more water that way. So we're gonna start with just the lemon and dissolve the sugar as much as we can into that. And then from there, if we need to add a splash of water, we will. But some of these early recipes call for as much as an ounce of water, which is too much water. For the lemon, the earliest recipes don't have measurements volumetrically. They just ask for generally half a lemon. So I had a little bit left in that previous half, and then I'm gonna use a new half as well. Again, this wildly varies at the time. Some of the earliest recipes call for only a quarter of a lemon, which I don't really feel is enough. I say more lemon the better, but it's totally up to you. And then for this, we will be using sugar. I've got some ultrafine here, and I'm going to take about a bar spoon of it. And then hopefully we'll be able to dissolve this without needing any additional liquid. Just a hair floating in there. I'll add just a splash of water. Okay, yeah, there's just a little bit still in there, not much at all. I'm gonna add some ice and then we will add in our whiskey. So the early fixes tended to have shaved ice, but by the time we see most sours, we're into a point where we're using either cracked ice or chunks of ice or that sort of thing. So that's what I'm gonna be doing here. Then for our whiskey, we now want 2 ounces, that's a 60 milliliter pour. And I'm going to stay at 100 proof, but move to something with just a little bit more character to it. This is Knob Creek. Let's give that a stir. Then here for our garnish, we are just going to use the lemon twist, which would have been the common way to do things back in the day. They would sometimes actually specify not just to wave, but to rub the lemon twist over the rim of the drink. So we will do that as well, and then toss it in. And that is an 1880s-ish whiskey sour. Ooh, so now, of course, the nose is lemon, and then there's just a hair of bourbon hiding beneath it. It's like, ooh, what is that? It's dark. It's bourbon. Yeah, so this is more what I'm looking for. There's a ton of pucker right up front, plenty of lemon going bam, and then instantly mellowing into the whiskey. And so just as it sits there, even since I've taken the last drink, it continues to develop just this little bit of wood, of heat, of a little bit of dark spices just building up in my throat, back of palate. But the front of the drink opens so big, just lemon forward, and then all that other stuff happens. There's just enough sugar in there to keep things from being, almost astringent, and to take just the edge off of the bourbon. But that's a really fun drink. I like the look of it. Stirred, it's a little bit more translucent. Without the foam or the egg, we don't get quite the same mouthfeel, but I do like the flavor more. It's just a great drink. There's not that much to say about it. It's basically lemon and bourbon. Use good bourbon and plenty of lemon, and you're gonna have just a great time. All right, for our final drink, I want to talk about something a little bit afield of the whiskey sour. As I mentioned, while sours got really crazy in the 1880s, 1890s, once we get into the 20th century, they toned down quite a bit. All of that experimentation and wild things being added to them move into what's happening with cocktails. And sours get left as a fairly clear thing, the only difference being sort of which base spirit you employ, though already at this point whiskey is gaining quite a bit of popularity on that front. There are a few exceptions though, and so one of them that sticks around, or is created, shows up in Tom Bullock's 1917 The Ideal Bartender, which is a book that I find really fascinating. I've mentioned it before on the show, but Tom Bullock was the first Black American bartender to get a cocktail book published. And it also has a foreword written by Herbert Walker, or George Herbert Walker, as in like the Bush's great-grandfather, which is just a baffling set of things that I can't stop bringing up because it's weird. But he has a drink in the 1917 book called a Stone Sour. And this is a gin-based sour that adds orange juice. And so some folks have argued, I don't remember if it was Wondrich or Dale DeGroff, one of them argues this is actually a variant on a gimlet, possibly the first variant on a gimlet, which is interesting, and that might be true. But anyway, it's called a Stone Sour. It's in the sour sort of family. And this drink exists for a while, though it's not incredibly popular. But it's a gin sour, Old Tom gin. It's actually a really tasty little drink. And then in the 70s, it gets changed into, or not changed, but it gets sort of supplanted in popularity by the Amaretto Stone Sour, which becomes this drink that subs in amaretto, which is a liqueur that is very low proof by comparison to whiskey, as the base spirit, rather than just adding it as a component, which some folks did like to add amaretto to a sour in place of some of the sweetener. But amaretto stone sours become a thing, and for this brief window in the sort of late 70s to early 80s, this drink is on fire. And so I just find it weird that it exists, and also I know some folks from that generation who this was just the drink that they were introduced to as like, yeah, what you order when you go out is obviously an amaretto stone sour. And it's just a weird drink in that sense that it just very much doesn't exist today. And it's a very low proof version of a drink that's normally mostly whiskey. And so it just fits in that fun, weird world of, the example I always bring up is Harvey Wallbangers, because it's just fun to say. But it's very much in that world, and so I thought we'd make one of those today. Now you can really get a feel for when a drink was made and what sort of drink it is when nearly every recipe you see for it, even in otherwise fairly reputable sites and sources, call for sour mix. That's always a sign of a certain sort of drink if you need sour mix. So obviously I don't have sour mix, because why would I? So we're gonna make our own version of that first. So we're gonna start with half an ounce. Oh, that's empty. We're gonna start with half an ounce, or 15 milliliters, of lemon juice. Then half an ounce, or 15 milliliters, of lime juice. And then to taste, somewhere between a quarter ounce and half an ounce of simple. If you're using 2-to-1, like I am and recommend, I would cheat toward a quarter ounce, but feel free to go to your taste. So that's somewhere between about 7 and 15 milliliters of your simple. So that in total is 45 milliliters, 1.5 ounces of our sour mix. Then we want the same 45 milliliters, or 1.5 ounces, of fresh orange juice. And then this is equal parts, so the same 45 milliliters, 1.5 ounces of our amaretto liqueur. I'm using Di Serrano, which I think I also used in last week's episode, which is weird because I literally haven't opened this bottle in years. That's all we need. Let's grab some ice and shake it. Let's give it a shake. Then this one we're going to strain right onto some rocks. This one would have been a good idea to double strain to try to grab some of that pulp, but it's an amaretto stone sour. I don't think that anyone's going to be bothered by a little bit of pulp in it. It's a fun, bright drink. This one, of course, gets some garnishes. We're going to throw in a couple of partial orange wheels. And we're going to throw in a cherry. Just a hint of juice there. And this is a pretty decent quality amaretto stone sour. So on the nose, I'd get amaretto. So much amaretto. Amaretto, if you haven't had it, traditionally it's an almond-based liqueur. Now it's not always made with almonds. It was traditionally made with bitter almonds, which happen to have a whole bunch of cyanide in them, which isn't necessarily great, but it was probably safe. And now sometimes they use other things, and it doesn't matter. But it's got a real sort of marzipan vibe to it. So yeah, it's tasty. It's a very sweet drink, obviously. It's pleasant, though. The orange and lemon are sort of the backbone. The lime is more acting as a modifier. And then there's just a whole bunch of that sort of marzipan, sweet almond paste sort of vibe. It's just right in the middle, and then it lingers a little bit too. That's your aftertaste. Yeah, feels kind of Christmassy almost. I think again that's just marzipan I'm thinking of, but it's got warm, nutty, little bit sweet, quite a bit sweet, pretty bright. I like it. I think that's a very tasty drink. And I said how different it is from a sour in one way because you really don't have a base spirit, right? So when we were making the Whisky Sours, those bourbons were 100 proof. Even a lower proof bourbon is going to be 80 proof. This is like less than 60 proof. It's 50 some proof. So that is actually could be a positive thing in many environments if you don't want to be slamming back drinks full of 100 proof spirits. This is a perfectly reasonable sour alternative that doesn't have that going on. I think for my palate, I would cut back the sugar even a bit more, so I would go just barely a quarter ounce, a little scant of it, so something like 7 milliliters. And I want just something slightly, I just am gonna see if I ruin this with 2 healthy dashes of Ango. I just want something to slightly cut it. It's not quite cloying, but it's trying to be. Wow, that doesn't stir with all the garnishes. That actually helps. It takes the very front edge off, and then I still have all the marzipan amaretto happening in the middle. But now, right at the back of the palate, I'm actually getting the bitters, and they're sort of fitting in as their own thing. Yeah, that's an improvement. Well, thanks so much for coming along with me this week as we looked at a few sours of both the whiskey and non-whiskey varieties. It's definitely fertile ground. I think we could definitely do a future episode after all the IBA stuff, digging into sours a little more, maybe either into just other spirits or into that time when sours got crazy and had so many different weird ingredients in them. But either way, that's all we have for this week. Visit the blog at shakingandsipping.com for a write-up on this and each other drink, as well as most weeks the day after the video posts a write-up of IBA in real life, where I go to a local Seattle cocktail bar, order the drink, see if it's common there, what variants they have on it, etc. Follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping for Twitter-type updates when we're doing those, IBA in real worlds, and other things like that. And please do all the YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, comment, bell ring, that stuff would be very much appreciated. Well, that's it for this week. We'll be back next week with the next drink on the IBA's list, which is the final drink on the Unforgettable section. So until then, happy sipping. Cheers.